Inga iwi, inga mana, inga hoa mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana ki a koutou, kua tai mai ki te tōtuko tēnei kaupapa. Ngā miti nui ki a Professor David Teece, te kai kōrero o te rā. Tēnā koe, David. Ko Tim Ing tōku ingoa, nau mai haere mai ki te tai ohanga. Welcome everyone, I'm Tim Ing, a Strategic Economic Advisor at the Treasury. It's my pleasure to be your host for today's session. It's great to see everyone online joining today's Treasury Guest Lecture Series event, which I promise will be a really interesting one. Let me extend a special welcome to Professor David Teece, who we're honoured to have as our guest today. David and I are going to engage in a conversation where I'll be asking him about recent developments in the dynamic capabilities approach and their implications for public management and private sector innovation. I'll say a bit more about David and our topic in a few moments. Before I do that, let me provide a little bit of context for today's session. As I hope many of you will know now, this event is part of Treasury's current guest lecture series theme, which is productivity in a changing world. We've been running this theme for a few months now, featuring some top economists from around the world, joined today by David Teece, with more to come. You can see videos of these sessions on the Treasury website at www.treasury.govt.nz. You can also feel free, please, to sign up to be updated about our future events and speakers if you haven't done that already. Our theme emphasises that productivity is widely accepted as a key foundation for economic development, prosperity, and overall well-being. As the world around us evolves quickly, New Zealand, like all countries, faces the challenge of maintaining and lifting productivity broadly to cope with the opportunities and the threats associated with major technological, social, and environmental shifts. Someone who's thought long and hard about innovation at the coalface of business and how it drives productivity and economic performance more widely is Professor David Teece, who's my guest for today. David, of course, needs very little introduction to students and scholars of business and management. Back in the 90s, David pioneered the dynamic capabilities framework in strategic management, which emphasised the ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing environments. We're going to unpack that framework in a second and its implications for productivity and organisational performance throughout this conversation. For those who are less familiar and want an up-to-date entree into the literature, I can recommend David's paper published in the New Zealand Economic Papers in 2017, which have the title A Capability Theory of the Firm, an Economics and Strategic Management Perspective. Let me take a moment now just to say a little bit about David, and I'm noting here that I'm summarising his CV massively. He's the Thomas W. Tusher Professor at the Institute for Business Innovation at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. He is also the Faculty Director of the school's Tusher Initiative for the Management of Intellectual Capital. He has authored over 30 books and 200 scholarly papers. He's received 8 honorary doctorates and has been recognised by royal honours. David has a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania and has held teaching and research positions at Stanford University and Oxford University. He received his Masters of Commerce degree from the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. David has over 30 years of experience as an active consultant performing economic, business, and financial consulting services to businesses and governments around the world. So today I'm going to put a bunch of questions to David about his most recent work on dynamic capabilities and business performance, drawing out the implications for New Zealand. We'll also touch on issues for public policy and the public sector. Just as for business, I think we'll see that the rapidly changing environment poses similar challenges for adaptation and innovation within public sector organisations. So the plan for the rest of the session is to have our conversation between David and me in the next 45 minutes or so. Then we'll open up the floor to viewers to ask questions of David. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A function in Teams at any time. You'll see the button on the top row of the Teams interface. For those of you that are joining by phone, you feel free to use the chat function as well. It's easier for us if everyone uses the Q&A function, but if you need to, you can use chat as well, and we'll keep that. We'll monitor that channel also. On our side, we're going to collect up the questions, and after our 45 minutes of conversation, I'll put the audience questions to David for his thoughts. Once again, welcome, David. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for your time and willingness to have a conversation with us about dynamic capabilities and related topics. Perhaps if I could begin by asking you, could you please explain the main elements of the dynamic capabilities framework and how you came to be interested in this topic?
Yes. Well, the main elements of dynamic capabilities are the following. First of all, we have to begin to think about capabilities in general. We know about individual capabilities, but we don't know much about organizational capabilities. And in my mind, organizational capabilities fall into two big categories. There's sort of ordinary capabilities, which I think we're all familiar with, and that's what we learn in the textbooks in economics. It's about being efficient, um, and um, and then there's something, and by efficient I mean efficient at a certain set of activities. But what's most critical in the economy, particularly a dynamic economy where there's deep uncertainty, is are you doing the right set of activities? So firms constantly have to be thinking about are they doing the right things, and not are they doing things right? I mean, efficiency is about optimization and doing things right, but more important is to make sure you do the right things. And so that involves really figuring out the future and innovating and reorganizing and transforming so that you're actually addressing what the marketplace needs, not what you did yesterday, because that's what you're good at. So it's sort of surprising that there is no notion of capabilities in economic theory. Certainly, economic historians recognize the importance of it, but my sort of quest as a scholar is to try and build a capabilities theory of the firm. And as you noted with that New Zealand economic paper that you cited, I'm really aspiring to build a theory of the firm because without a theory of capabilities, I don't know how you can have a robust, sensible, usable theory of the firm. And so the good news is that this capabilities concept has really taken off in business schools and in management schools. And of course, it's always been in the military, but it's now taken off in business schools. And now we have the hard job of getting it into economics. But as you know, and I think you've heard from Nicholas Bloom, economists are now recognizing 150 years too late that management matters too. And there's empirical evidence to support that. And when we say management, we really mean management capabilities and strategy and all of those woolly things that we'd sooner not have to deal with. So capabilities are about essentially how you build organizations and keep them relevant, not just respond to changes, but actually shape markets, and shape outcomes and shape the business environment itself.
Do you see any tensions between achieving sort of best practice, ordinary capabilities, doing the things you're doing, static efficiency, if you like, doing the things you know how to do and for your current circumstances, and shifting to new circumstances?
You're absolutely right. I mean, what people don't realize is that the headlong pursuit of efficiency can actually drive you away from innovation and change because the minute you change something, that screws up your chances of being efficient. So, in a broad brush way, New Zealand went through the reforms of the 90s, which were very much focused on efficiencies, and I think that's a good thing to be focused on. But it's not the only thing to be focused on, and I would argue it's not the main thing to be focused on. What the main thing to be focused on is innovation and change, and dynamic capabilities is sort of the framework that I use to help managers and policymakers. When I say it's a framework that I use, it's a framework that I've developed and try to use to help managers and policymakers figure out how to invest in the right things and bring about the change that's necessary for the world we live in today versus the world we lived in yesterday.
What do you think are the most, since you began working on this, which was several decades ago, I think the 90s, the papers in the 90s that are widely cited, what do you think have been what have been the most impactful developments or applications of the framework that you've seen, whether it's in particular countries or by particular firms? Where have you seen the pickup?
Well, first of all, the managers in Silicon Valley, I mean, they've been doing this from day one. I mean, all I've done with dynamic capabilities is try to make explicit the set of implicit rules and understandings that any executive, any successful executive in Silicon Valley or any other area of rapid technological change, it's what they're familiar with. So the language of dynamic capabilities may be hard for an economist to digest, but I can tell you it's not hard for anybody in Silicon Valley to digest. It's what they do. So when you talk about applications of it, it's been applied by every dynamic organization, and we've had many, but it's not being applied, of course, in those that are having trouble. Most likely, it's not. I suppose that, a related question is, have we been able to actually take organizations that that are not innately dynamically capable and make them more capable? Well, say yes. I mean, I actually ended up being a board-appointed mentor to the CEO of Intel for 2 years. It was the hardest job I ever had. But we managed to make some significant strategic changes, not enough. And it took, a year or two, even after my engagement there, before you saw any tangible outcomes. And I would claim to only be a small player in that. But yes, even companies in Silicon Valley need to be reminded of some of the basics. And there's other organizations as well, automotive companies and so forth, where this language has really helped. At minimum, it changes people's priorities. If I can change people's priorities and get them to do the right things and to take a bit more risk, I mean, the big problem is that boards of directors need to be supportive as well. It's not just a matter of changing managerial mindsets. You've got to change boards, because the boards will say no because it, quote, looks too risky. But what they don't know is that not doing anything is riskier still. So there's no kind of big victories that we can count up. There's lots of small victories, though, and that are taking place, certainly in the classroom, but also in the executive suite, and in the future, we hope, in public agencies.
Just let me pursue that a little bit, because the Intel example, I mean, I'm not asking you to reveal anything about Intel specifically, but I'll be very interested to hear what were the changes you saw, in general, that's sort of general changes. Intel is still around and is still very successful, which is I think a key prediction of the dynamic capabilities framework is that this is a necessary component of longevity with firms. When you said it took a year or two to see some change, I actually think that's pretty quick. With some of my experience of trying to achieve change in organizations. But how did you, what did you see, and what would you say makes these sorts of changes in mindsets or behaviors or routines stick in an organization? How does it become self-perpetuating?
Well, part of the change was actually getting them to stop doing something that they were investing in that didn't have any chance of succeeding, because it was just excessive commitment by the management team and a belated effort to try and catch up in the mobile space. But I'm not sure we engineered much in the organization at large, and it's taken a change in management since I was there to, in fact, bring that about, and I think that's occurring. It often takes a shock to actually get this on the agenda of companies, because it always seems like something that you can worry about tomorrow rather than today until tomorrow arrives.
And what would be the preconditions for successful investment in dynamic capabilities? So I'm thinking, you've talked about entrepreneurial sort of value firms, and I don't just mean young firms, firms with an entrepreneurial mindset. But if you have an industry, like a firm, or indeed an industry that is might see itself as mature, how do you bring about? What are the preconditions needed to shift their mindset into something that's a little bit more dynamic and adaptive?
Well, it lies in the top management team and with the board. Even if people on the front line are concerned about it, unless that gets to the management team and the board, sort of nothing happens. So, I was dealing with a European lead acid battery company recently, and they know that the clock is ticking to their exit, but to actually get them to put today's profits away and today's cash flow away and embrace the new, it seemed too risky. And the board was not willing to make what I thought was a relatively small investment to reposition the company. And so sometimes it happens because of fear of taking too much risk. But let's take Kodak. When Kodak actually invented a lot of the digital technologies for photography, but they were stuck with their current business model, and they did not invest behind their own inventions. And so sometimes it's fear of cannibalization. But I always point out, well, if you're not going to cannibalize yourself, someone else is better to cannibalize yourself and let somebody else do it. But you've got, habits of mind, and the successes of the past are often enemies of what needs to be done. That's organizational transformation, which is not the only component of dynamic capabilities, but it's sensing, seizing, and transforming. Of course, there's huge literatures in organizational behavior on this, and very little of that creeps over and informs economic analysis, but it should.
Yes, I know you've done some work, very interesting work recently on competition policy and administration of competition, administrative decisions about mergers and so on. I wonder if you have any reflections on what the dynamic capabilities way of thinking says about acquisitions, how we should view corporate acquisitions. Because you've written about how they can be about growing market share, or they can be about acquiring capabilities that you don't have, as opposed to growing them yourself. Any observations there?
Yeah, Tim, a very good point. Look, there is this sort of efficiencies defense for mergers, but just think about it. Efficiency is about ordinary capabilities. Mergers can help or hinder dynamic capabilities. If you're trying to build out a complex system, like Meta trying to build out the metaverse, there's no way they can potentially develop all the technologies to make the metaverse go. So you need to do a whole bunch of acquisitions, that are more complementary than they're competitive. But to think of it as efficiencies, I mean, we have this old, and we're bringing these industrial age concepts. We're still using industrial age concepts. And economists try to get over this by saying, oh, it's dynamic efficiencies, not realizing that it's a contradiction in and of itself. And in fact, what you need is dynamic capabilities. And that means part of dynamic capabilities is this, putting together of the right set of assets to configure and reconfigure. This is what management is about. And you gave the definition of dynamic capabilities earlier. And core to it is this notion of configuration and reconfiguration, and that involves bringing forward a whole variety of different capabilities to make a complex system work. And the digital world is more about systems than the mechanical world is about systems. So competition policies both stuck with a view of competition that I call static competition. And really it should focus on dynamic competition. An innovation first approach is really the way I like to think about competition policy. And I've written quite a number of papers on that. And an important component also of looking at the monopoly problem and understanding why firms are successful and whether business conduct is the reason, bad business conduct is the reason why they've gotten the monopoly power or not, is to also look at their capabilities. So I'm trying to get capabilities approach into competition policy. In one area where this may be possible, there's a discussion now about sort of nascent competitors. And I'm actually glad that's out there, because there's been no innovation and new ideas in the area of potential competition for 70 or 80 years. So the idea of a nascent competitor, though, what does it mean? It's a company that portends to be a major competitor in the future. Well, how can a competition agency figure that out unless they have a capabilities framework in the first place? So, venture capitalists do this every day, of course. They're trying to figure out, amongst the startup community, which ones of these nascent competitors can they scale? And that brings me to an important point that cuts to the chase with respect to New Zealand. It's not enough to have startups. A startup is not a nascent competitor. It's only once it's proved it can scale, in my view, that it really should be thought of as even a potential competitor. And this is a problem New Zealand has. It's got a lot of startups. New Zealand's startup environment is great, but if you look at how many of them scale to be globally significant or even significant in a regional basis, it's very, very small. And in dynamic capabilities, you have this sensing, seizing, transforming mantra, and getting the seizing part right, and garnering the resources and the capital, and having the mindset and the supportive board and the alliances and all of those things that are needed to scale. Is something that needs a lot more attention in policy as well as in the boardroom.
We have, I think this is very opposite to the New Zealand situation, as we have, you talked about systems and you talked about, the different external resources that an entrepreneurial firm or a firm with good dynamic capabilities should draw upon as it's orchestrating and reconfiguring, etc. So New Zealand has a bit of a venture capital industry. It has a bit of a research, science and innovation sector. It has some clusters in some places. It has what the OECD thinks are favorable static efficiency policy settings. What do you think is the weakest link, and where would you invest in this system?
I think what's missing is the ability to scale. I mean, New Zealand is not the only country that has this. Think of the UK and the Cambridge cluster, whole, thousands of little firms around Cambridge University, many hundreds for sure. But, the average employment is, 20, 15, 30. It's small. So why can't British firms scale globally? Why can't European firms scale globally? Look, Europe doesn't have a single big tech firm. Spotify doesn't count. But the US and China do. And I think there's several things. One is, the most important one, I think, is mindset. The third one is, having the networks and the capital. It's not so much the market, because Europe's a pretty big market, but there's a state of mind issue here that is really critical to, and it's embedded in dynamic capabilities. It's you need these entrepreneurial managers or a team, a top management team that could be entrepreneurial even in a big firm. Historically, we've thought of entrepreneurial firms as little startups, and big firms, well, that's where managers take over. Well, yeah, you need a different type of manager to stay in there. Yes, there's always going to be a lot of process and routines and so forth you have to build in you need an adult in the room, but you don't want to throw out the entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial thinking and the entrepreneurial mindset.
What is so you focused on mindset and maybe governance, or it has implications for governance, perhaps, coming back to our original theme, the remark we made earlier about sometimes there are tensions for leadership, senior management to manage between static efficiency, which is a good thing, and adaptability, which may look inefficient in the short term when you're chasing something in the medium term. How would you characterize the best tuned corporate governance behaviors and leadership behaviors within organizations?
Well, yeah, if I remember right, if you look at the composition of New Zealand boards, most of them have got finance and accounting backgrounds. To me, that's, relatively unimportant. When I say relatively unimportant, it doesn't mean it's not important. It is important. But if you don't have people that understand technology markets and linkages and networks, you're going to be perfecting your ordinary capabilities, and everybody's focused on preventing malfeasance. I mean, Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States really caused a lot of misdirection, okay, there's some bad accounting issues, but that's where boards are spending their time. And we're in a global geopolitical crisis, where markets are shifting and technologies are changing and regulations are changing. You need a very different set of capabilities at the board level, and I don't think New Zealand has been selecting the right people for a long time. And maybe that means people that are not necessarily New Zealanders, but people who have an external orientation, and people that have built and scaled large companies from wherever you can find them.
Do you have any practical suggestions about measurement and monitoring, like or self-assessment? How would a firm know if it's got the right level of spending the right amount of time thinking about these issues that you're talking about? Changing markets, the dynamic environment, how to respond to it, how to shift the business. How much time are we talking about, would you say, just to make it very simple?
Well, I think 80% of the time should be spent on that, and 20% on sort of, I'll call it routine governance. My sense is that routine governance is more like 80%, and this other stuff is 20%. So I have never seen any survey results, but that would be my guess from the limited exposure I've had to New Zealand boards. No one's embracing big ideas. I mean, my little exposure to New Zealand 3 or 4 times, I had a chance to talk to boards, and they were just very comfortable where they were, and there wasn't this thirst. If you went into Chinese companies, there's a thirst to know what's going on in the rest of the world and how can you do things better. There isn't that thirst, at least in my limited exposure in New Zealand.
Okay. It's interesting to turn to that. I'll just remind folks that together with a colleague from your consulting firm, the Berkeley Research Group, in 2020, you produced from New Zealand's Productivity Commission a report into frontier, this idea of frontier firms. We have perhaps one, Frontiera. And the frontier firms are defined for this purpose as firms that are at the top of their game. And then we've got the other firms. And I think your recommendation in that report was to say, well, probably the bulk of the firms, the rest, if you like, need to focus on their ordinary capabilities, which is actually reasonably easy to do in the sense that we know about, as you say, the textbook best practices for managing for static efficiency. While the frontier firms, should be doing what you're talking about with dynamic capabilities and looking outwards, scanning the environment, being thirsty, etc. Since that report, we've had COVID, massive disruption, and I don't bring that up as an excuse, but just as a test case of saying, well, that's an example of massive environmental change. Whether in New Zealand or elsewhere, what lessons do you think we can learn about the effectiveness of dynamic capabilities to deal with something like that, an event like that? It's upends the way we do things, even business as usual.
Well, look, a number of companies turned on a dime and did very well during COVID, including the Berkeley Research Group, for that matter. And some companies couldn't. I mean, the tourist industry in New Zealand, of course, there was no place to go. It couldn't pick itself up and move anywhere else, and most other places were just as bad anyway. So, but I think what COVID does is that's, of course, a great example of a black swan. I mean, you can't use that term in New Zealand, of course, but of an unknown unknown. And the world, we're going to have more, but there won't be pandemics necessarily. But, you could have a war in the South China Sea. You could have major disruption to trading relationships. This is what people should be engaged in: scenario planning, building optionality in, building robustness into supply chains. I'm not sure there's much of that going on. I think, European and U.S. companies are starting to think about it, but, they're not doing much. And at the same time, it involves more expense. I mean, if I've got to diversify my supply chain, maybe I'm going to have to pay a little more to get there. But the other sacrifices that should be being made now to build resilience in. Otherwise what happens is people turn around and look to the government when it's too late, and that's not fair. Business needs to build it in now, yesterday. Um, and with two regional wars going on, and the possibility of a third one, this is as risky a geopolitical environment as Europe 1938. And I don't see that moving the needle much, um, but I think it should. And then you've got AI coming along. You've got major step function. Good news is sort of improvements in technology, but are also going to require a certain amount of regulation. But we should be thinking and acting on these issues now. And that's what, dynamic capabilities is always having this sense of urgency. You cannot be, every entrepreneur has a sense of urgency and fear. If your management team doesn't have urgency and fear, it's unlikely that it's dynamically capable. Andy Grove at Intel used the term "only the paranoid survive." And why did he use that term paranoid? And it's because in the world of dynamic competition, which is driven by technology and to some extent by geopolitics, you don't know where the next competition is coming from. So I want to write a book one day called Competition Without Competitors to sort of highlight this. Of course, there are competitors there. You just don't know who they are and when they're going to appear on your doorstep. But you've got to be prepared for those eventualities. It's about pulling out some of the old tricks, like scenario planning is one of the tools that can be used for management under deep uncertainty.
Let's turn a little bit to the public sector and policy of organizations. You mentioned resilience or the supply chain and other sort of features of a strong economy depend on the government playing its part as well in terms of policy and the behaviour of public sector organisations. So you've looked recently, I think, at the implications of the dynamic capabilities framework for public sector organisations. What similarities and differences with food?
Well, there's some of both. In terms of differences, of course, the public sector doesn't face the same competition. If you're in business, you stay paranoid because you don't know where the competition is coming from. In a public agency, so long as you can secure budget, you're fine. So the competition is with other agencies to get budget, but it's very limited and muted. And this year's budget is usually last year's plus some small increment if you're lucky. So there's no force of competition in the public agencies. So that makes dynamic capabilities all the more remote, or doesn't seem like it's necessary until you get to the position where most public agencies are now, which they're performing so poorly that there's general agreement in the electorate or general recognition in the electorate that the public sector is not performing. And then, you've got political backlash, and the first reaction is, well, we got to cut. Well, yes, if you can't make it better, you should cut. But in fact, you need to empower people in the bureaucracies to make decisions. I mean, taking a risk and getting it wrong, is failure for a civil servant. In Silicon Valley, taking a risk and getting it wrong is a chance to do it over again. So that's another big difference between the public and the private sector. You do get a second chance. So, and as we say in Silicon Valley, it's okay to fail. You just have to fail graciously, and not blame everybody and take it on the chin. And it's not a scarlet letter to fail. So we have to change the attitude about failure, because you won't get any risk taking unless the attitude to failure is changed. And without any risk taking, you're not going to be able to embrace the new. Every time you embrace the new and the different, it involves taking a risk. And public servants tend to want to be safe and just keep doing what they're doing and not, rock the boat. But you've got to rock the boat to bring about change and to bring about reform. And I think New Zealand needs that as much as everybody else.
It's an interesting test case, perhaps, because the reforms of the late 80s and 90s, new public management reforms, if you like, I think you could characterize them as being focused on ordinary capabilities in the public sector. What do you add to, and of course that's public sector needs to have good ordinary capabilities. What would you add to it? What would you add to the new public management set of structures?
Yeah, I would make it an innovation first approach, not just innovating with respect to public sector reforms and changes and services, but innovating with respect to pushing policies that create and allow more innovation in the private sector. So, the 80s and 90s efficiency was in the driver's seat. Now we put efficiencies in the back seat and put innovation and change in the driver's seat. That's at a very general level, I think, how you change the priorities. It's not to denigrate efficiencies, it's just to recognize that, particularly when there's deep uncertainty and rapid technological change, innovation and the management of innovation and change becomes of greater significance.
And we've got, I agree with that. One of the features of our environment to promote dynamic capabilities, I would say, is that we've got government programs and spending for that purpose. You think of Callaghan Innovation and the Trade and Enterprise that support businesses to look outwards, to innovate, etc. What's your view on the role of government in that area? How should they think about their mission or their value that they're adding?
I think there's some really good stuff going on with Callaghan Innovation and things like that. I mean, it was pathetic, a couple of decades ago, and but it's not just about spending money on R&D. That's important, but it's creating an innovation ecosystem. And there's a good startup ecosystem, I think, in Auckland and some other places, maybe even around Christchurch. But as I said before, there's not enough emphasis on scaling, and I'm not sure the policies really support that. Look, I'm not an expert on New Zealand circumstance. These are just impressions I have from casual conversations and my own experience.
Are there other countries which you think have got the mix right? Small countries around, in Europe, for example, everyone thinks of the Scandinavian, the Nordic countries, for example, they've had some successes.
I mean, I don't think Europe as a whole is a great success at all. I mean, I think they burden themselves with way too much regulation. But I mean, Israel is, of course, a great case study of a country that's figured out how to build an innovation and entrepreneurship, is core to its economy, and that has been a dramatic transformation over the last 25, 30 years. But even in industries in New Zealand like tourism, which you think, well, where does innovation fit in there? You and I were discussing this the other day. I see New Zealand saying, oh, we should take in less backpackers and more high-end tourists who can spend more money. Well, that's one way to think about it. But, there's a real opportunity, I think, for what is called workations, getting the Googleites to come and spend 6 months in New Zealand, hanging out in Auckland or Christchurch, mixing with the local entrepreneurs in the evening while they do their day jobs and 9 to 5 or whatever they choose to do, and then enjoying the great outdoors in New Zealand. I mean, there's all kinds of new ways because of the changing nature of work for New Zealand to actually bring in not just dollars, but bring in ideas and bring in talent, because it's not just dollars that's going to drive the economy. It's more upgrading of skills and bringing in new ideas and then building organizations that can scale that into something of global significance.
Okay. that is really interesting. I think it might be a good time to see what audience. We've actually covered a lot of territory, from corporate governance to the structure of the economy to the role of policy and the behaviour of public sector organisations. But just before I turn to the questions from the audience, please keep them coming, by the way, all the people out there online. Let's just finish off this segment with, if I can ask you, what's one piece of advice you would give a director or any senior executive? What should they think about when they get back to their desk after this conversation?
I don't know if there's any one piece of advice, but the general gestalt would be, I need to panic. Panic because we've been sitting, it's been too sweet for too long, and we're not really ready for the challenges ahead and for the opportunities ahead. It's not just about, you're not going to build productivity in New Zealand until you are in smarter industries and using the most advanced technologies. I mean, companies with stronger dynamic capabilities pay higher wages and can and higher profits at the same time. So getting accessing technology and innovating will allow you to expand employment and pay higher wages.
Excellent. Well, lovely. Thank you for all of those observations and for answering my questions, David. That's been really insightful. I mean, I'm struck by a few things. One is the sort of commonalities in some ways between the public and the private sector. The reasons to panic are different. The corporate sector, I guess, you're worried about somebody coming and eating your lunch. In the public sector, it's a sudden change in political regime, perhaps. And that's the concern. But the behaviours and mindsets, I think you're arguing, are similar, that you need to always be scanning and, as you say, sensing, seizing, transforming to respond to those likely challenges. Let me go to the questions. We've got one that goes back to the competition idea that's come through in the chat. The question is, when the objective is to promote innovation, what role or specific actions can the economic regulator of monopoly infrastructure play in order to bring about change in the focus and skill set of regulated suppliers, board and management?
Yeah, I'm not sure the competition agencies can, they don't have all the levers. I mean, they have some of the levers, but I think, breathing the atmosphere of innovation and asking the question, is this company innovating? I mean, first of all, if you're innovating, you're, quote, in my view, of course, a better company. Are you doing things that are preventing other people from innovating? Then that is something that should be looked at. Or are you partnering with companies that are innovating to create something better? But I think getting away from the short-term consumer welfare approach, I think, is one thing that's helpful, because the consumer welfare standard has, in effect, become a short-term standard. And, we should be managing and setting policy for the long run. So I favor a long-term consumer welfare standard, and a good proxy for that in competition policy is the innovation ecosystem. Is the actions and the conduct at issue, are they improving the innovation ecosystem, or are they harming it in some way? I think that's a useful way to think about how to bring competition policy to bear. And competition is important for innovation, no question about it. But innovation is also important for competition. And that's the bit that the agencies don't really focus on. And that runs the risk of, well, sometimes you can, maybe not an issue in New Zealand, but in the United States, you can end up slamming an innovator and actually creating less innovation and less competition.
there's certainly, I can think of cases where that's happened. At the other sort of perhaps at the micro level as well, there's potentially, this is a question about regulation and more generally and disclosure obligations and that sort of thing. And the question is, in New Zealand, many regulations are based around ensuring that there's a paper trail that the board has considered X, Y, Z and maybe legislation requirements and so on. And by the time the alphabet has been covered of all of those things, there isn't much time for any other focus. That's a proposition. What do you think of that proposition? True or false?
Well, that fits into, if that's true, it supports my observation that 80% is spent on the wrong things and 20% on the right things. Look, it seems to me that that kind of stuff doesn't really, should go to a board committee. I mean, maybe the audit committee can handle that. And let's have the board have good, robust conversations with management around the competitive landscape. So use the committee structure to put that, to get the regular work of the board done so that the board can actually focus on the board's work.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so let me talk about scaling up. There's a question come through here, and you mentioned that that's a big missing strategic piece for New Zealand is our ability to scale, and clearly there's a lot of pieces in that puzzle. There's a question here, maybe you answered it before, but it's maybe asking it in a different way. What role could or should government play in the proposition about scaling up? What should the government avoid doing? And what's the realistic goal state for New Zealand for number and location of scale-ups, assuming that for many activities, scaling up will inevitably or necessarily lead to significant offshore presence?
Well, the last proposition is probably correct, but that doesn't mean that the scaling up, even if there's a significant offshore presence, won't result in also a significant scale up of an onshore presence in New Zealand. Like if the R&D or development activity stays in New Zealand, that's fantastic. That's the high wage piece, and you scale up globally, and a rising tide lifts all ships, including the New Zealand ship. I think, banks are very hard to deal with in New Zealand, is my experience, and they're becoming harder to deal with in the US. I mean, private equity is not necessarily good at helping firms grow. In some cases it is. But private capital of one kind or another needs to be brought to bear to help with the scaling operation, and maybe that's an area where New Zealand's a bit short. So maybe there's a way the government can lower the cost of expansion capital. I don't know if there are programs that way. I want to say expansion. I don't mean from 500,000 to 1 million, but getting a company that's at 10 million to 100 to 2 to 300 million. If there was a way to maybe make bank facilities and loan facilities where there's probably some collateral involved, so it's not hugely risky for the government, but that could be one way to help with scale up. But the most important thing is having people who know how to scale, having the ambition to scale. All of these other things matter too, and that's not necessarily within the control of government. I mean, I think, in New Zealand, we tend to look too much to, well, the government, what can the government do? What can we do? It should be also on people's mind. We, being the management and the population, the citizenry, and the culture of New Zealand should favor this too.
Right. Question from Alan Bollard. Which I think is partly about this. He's making the observation that certainly in some major markets, we're seeing an increase in what the economist has called homeland economics, or a turn or an encouragement for industry to look inward, homegrown industry, etc. For New Zealand, that's obviously, well, is it a threat or an opportunity that changes the resources that we can draw on, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, you refer to the United States, it's kind of true. The United States stayed open for a long time. Let China get away with a whole bunch of stuff under the WTO, essentially doing stuff that was never in the spirit of the WTO. And so the U.S. is pulling back some, but it's doesn't mean to pull back from its allies. I'm not saying it hasn't, but in my view, in the long run, it won't. So I see it actually as an opportunity for New Zealand, because it's not about the homeland. It's really about not being China. Um, we haven't sort of quite articulated that way yet, but that's really what it is. So I see it as more opportunity than it is threat. Alan, great question. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just looking through. There's lots of questions here. Oh, here's one that's kind of interesting. We talked about R&D, and many countries, probably all countries, have some sort of support for research and development activity on the grounds that it's underinvested in because it has, by the private sector, because it has spillovers, positive spillovers, etc. Do you have any reflections on R&D policy generally? And in New Zealand, we have, we currently have a tax credit for R&D expenditure, and we've also had grant schemes and other in-kind support for, and we've had in-kind support for R&D as well. What do you think? What's your sense of the landscape in terms of R&D support?
Yeah, excellent question. Look, I think R&D support's important, and I'm glad New Zealand is doing something about it now. But too many of us with economics training have this linear model that innovation sort of starts with research and development, and it moves on to development, then it moves on to manufacturing and marketing and so forth. But that's not the only way innovation takes place. In fact, it's not the main way that it takes place. And so the innovation ecosystem, good spend on R&D is a key asset to have in the ecosystem, but the job is not done. It's only just started, and if you've got the great technical breakthroughs, but then it's about figuring out whether there's a user and bringing it to market and scaling. All those other things matter. So let's take Nokia was spending 10% of its revenues on R&D, and it was a huge company. Apple's a small company spending 2% on R&D. The iPhone won over Nokia, just destroyed them because it wasn't because they had a better device per se, it was because of ecosystem thinking by Steve Jobs. He saw it as an internet device, and Nokia didn't see it quite the same way, and nor did Nokia have the capabilities. It's all about capabilities. Because Apple had iOS, because it had an operating system, it had greater software skills. It had the right capabilities. Nokia didn't. So it could downscale iOS and put it on the phone, or the downscale is System 7 or what it was called, put it on the phone, or at least it had the skills to do that. So, that's a great context where the big R&D spend are lost out. And of course, the ones that go the other way. You've got to think systems, always think systems. And the linear model of innovation died a long time ago. And so we have to think about all the other accoutrements, which is why, dynamic capabilities is I think relevant here, because I call it a poor man's systems theory, or a poor lady's systems theory. And if we had a full-blown systems theory, it'd be so complicated we wouldn't be able to get answers out of it. But the business enterprise is a system nested in a system. We need to adopt that type of thinking for shaping our policy and for doing our management. And of course, everybody in Silicon Valley does. I mean, Apple is aware they're running an ecosystem. Google's aware they're running an ecosystem. Microsoft is aware they're running an ecosystem. And there are regional ecosystems and corporate ecosystems embedded in regional ecosystems. So the metaphors from biology, as Alfred Marshall reminded us 120 years ago, are quite useful to economics, but it's different at the same time.
Okay, interesting examples. They are enormous companies, revenues bigger than New Zealand's GDP. So in New Zealand, we've got small, so this is a question prompted by Jack Bissett. Thanks, Jack. In New Zealand, we've got tiny companies, really, putting aside Frontiera. We've heard often around the traps, some companies consider themselves too small to even have a strategy team, which perhaps says something about how they're thinking about this. But anyway, there's little in the way of a strategy consulting market. So what would be the role of the corporate strategy function within small companies like that in terms of dynamic capabilities? Is it true that you have to have a certain size in order to...
No, it's not. I mean, first of all, corporate strategy is not necessarily a carved off function, but startup companies that are scaling, they don't have any trouble with dynamic capabilities. I mean, that's what they're doing. You know, they're learning, they can pivot on a dime, being able to pivot, and think, you know, at least not every small company, but most small companies, they don't have the baggage of the existing organization to slow them down. So dynamic capabilities comes more naturally. Where dynamic capabilities is hard is when you got the baggage of the existing company. You got both the baggage and the assets of the existing company, and they stand in the way, as they did with Kodak. And so, you know, this has to be infused through the culture of the company. It's not a function shoved off in strategic management. In fact, most companies don't have a strategic management group anyway. Strategic management is sort of what the board should be doing. But the problem is that it sort of gets confused with planning, and then it becomes financial planning. This stuff gets driven out, not just by, you know, the focus on audit, which we mentioned earlier, but also the quarterly focus and the financial performance. You know, all of that tends to, you know, prioritize operations rather than prioritizing innovation and change. So corporate culture and building an innovative culture in the organization, or keeping the culture you had when you were small as you grow, that is one way to keep an atmosphere conducive to dynamic capabilities. But even an atmosphere conducive to dynamic capabilities doesn't give you dynamic capabilities. You need a leadership team that, you know, is entrepreneurial, alert, and can sense, seize, and transform, is willing to take a risk, and has got the networks necessary to help the company get to where it needs to go.
Excellent. Let me turn to a question from Eric Crampton. Thanks, Eric. And this goes, I think, to the question of translating the effectiveness of the dynamic capabilities approach to the public sector, or to public sector organizations, or even, you know, whether it's policy or service delivery. So Eric says, companies applying the dynamic capabilities approach face a test in the market, right? It's a market discipline test. If they do things well, and if the approach works for them, then they'll flourish. If they execute badly, or if it's a cover, he says here, if it's a cover for managers who want more discretionary authority, then they'll fail. So there's a stiff market test, or a well-functioning market there is. What would provide that? If the public sector or public sector organisations were to adopt that approach of being innovative and dynamic and chasing, you know, risky ventures, if you like, in a public sector context, what sorts of disciplines would you say should be brought to bear against what Eric calls waffle, if this approach is adopted in policy?
Yeah, well, look, I haven't fully thought this through, and I don't think anybody has. In fact, you know, with Marianne Mazzucato at University College London, we're actually starting to work on exactly these issues. But it should be okay to fail with a good initiative in the public sector. I mean, that's one thing. So changing the culture to allow failure, and to allow experimentation, and, you know, in some cases that's there, and to encourage change, and to encourage, you know, finding ways to get user feedback. And, you know, there's limited efforts to do this by some agencies. They do surveys and what have you, but then nothing much changes. So I suppose where it all goes, because competition doesn't discipline you as much, it puts an even greater onus on leadership of the public agencies. So you have to drive it from the top and allow change and experimentation from the top, encourage it and support it, and not have it being a career loser if you push something new that didn't work out. It shouldn't be the end of your career. It should be the beginning of a new career. So that's where I think it's going to end up. And of course, we're lacking leadership in the public sectors. Well, maybe not in New Zealand, but in the U.S., where a lot of it is political. There's often an absence of leadership at the top, strong leadership that can bring about this change.
And then within the organization, I think you mentioned earlier in the conversation, it's not just leadership, although leadership is you're saying is necessary. Certainly that sounds very compelling. But within the organization, at the level of the workers, if you like, what would you say was the role of soft? This is a question from Upananda. What's the role of soft institutions, that is, shared habits and routines, used by actors in repetitive situations, organized by norms, rules, and strategies? How do you think about?
Well, that soft part is what I call culture. So that I think is very important, and but it's a job of leadership to cultivate it, to establish that culture if it's not there, and then keep it alive every day. So the soft stuff's very important. And it's hard for an economist to swallow this one, but I swallowed it 30 years ago because I had a good friend, Charles O'Reilly, who was an organizational psychologist. And in the end, as an economist, I said, well, look, if you've got a great culture, organizational culture, that's control on the cheap, because people do the right things, and you don't have to use incentives to get them there, because they have shared values and they get you there. So it's control on the cheap, and that should appeal to Treasury. Anytime you get something done efficiently. So there's a backdoor way for Treasury to favor an innovation culture, because if you build it, then you don't need to pay people as much to get the job done. It's a very pragmatic economist view.
Right.
Maybe cynical economist view.
Far be it for economists to be cynical, but let's talk about the evidence a little bit. You mentioned Nick Bloom, who's done quite a bit of work measuring business practices and their connection to productivity, etc. So this is really, I think, very squarely in the management capabilities territory. So what's your take on the evidence from Nick Bloom and others on the specific business practices?
Well, I've got a piece of the Strategic Management Journal where we looked just simply at one aspect of dynamic capabilities, and that's the ability to move cash around across businesses, So getting away from this sort of budget, you budget for this department or this division as last year's budget plus an increment, if you're lucky, but aggressively moving cash around led to double-digit improvements in financial performance, and that's an empirical study. We did a study also, it's published in the Strategic Management Journal, showing that in education, when there was more light-handed governance, you got better financial performance from the universities. So any university chancellor should be quoting that paper if they want to get the hand of Wellington off their back a little bit and have more freedom to allocate resources the right way. See, what's been happening with organizations is because of fear of misappropriation, there's tighter and tighter controls that come down over time and less discretion. And in these environments with a very narrow corridor of discretion, it's very hard to have strong dynamic capabilities. So, the Bloom stuff is, to my mind, it's passé. But it's news to economists, so I'm delighted he's doing it. It's pretty boring, actually. But if it persuades economists that management matters, then it's hugely important. And I think he's making some progress there, and I'm delighted for it. But it's very passé to anyone. We set up business schools in America 150 years ago because we thought management matters. So we didn't need to wait for for Nick Bloom's data to establish that reality. What he hasn't shown is the difference between ordinary and dynamic capabilities. He's looking mainly at ordinary, and maybe together we can figure out how to measure the impact of what I call superordinary capabilities and dynamic. I now have a tripartite schema: ordinary, which is best practice being efficient. Superordinary is the same set of activities, but you're beyond best practice, if it may sound like a bit of a contradiction. And then dynamic is this ability to figure out the next big thing and harness the resources, organize the systems, the alliances to get it done, and transform the organization if that's what it requires. So these are the things that matter. And I think even if we're not precise about it, if we just bring about the mind shift to the obvious. I mean, if you ask the average New Zealand voter if this stuff matters, or the average New Zealand person on the street, they would agree. What we're fighting is ourselves. So, you don't need scientific evidence that management matters. It's obvious.
Okay. Question from Arthur. This is a really interesting one, actually. Arthur Grimes. For a New Zealand firm, is a New Zealand stock market listing, maybe generalize it for any firm, I think, is a stock market listing likely to assist or restrict the expression of dynamic capabilities of the firm? And the question makes me think of, Arthur hasn't asked this, but makes me think of disclosure requirements.
Yeah, excellent.
More focus from the board on certain things. What's your take on stock market listing?
Yeah, excellent question, and I think you could generalize it beyond New Zealand. I think you have to exercise strong dynamic capabilities. You've got to bring the shareholder base along. I mean, I loved it when Netflix dropped DVDs through the mail, which was their main revenue stream, because they were going to go online, and the stock price dropped 30%. And I thought, this is great. They're throwing away the past to embrace the future, and I bought stock. I mean, I'm not a stock picker, but once every 2 or 3 or 4 years when I see something that blatant. So the market punished them. Now, if they'd spent a little bit more time communicating what the future was and why this made sense, maybe the market wouldn't have punished them as much. So to Arthur's point, if you're not adept at communicating with the shareholders, then it's a negative. But if you're really, Steve Jobs type with a silver tongue and investors go along with you and believe your story, then you're great. But you've got to persuade investors. Now, that's a lot easier if you got private equity there. You got 3 or 4 people around the boardroom, and you don't have to go through the preliminaries. They'll usually get it much sooner. So I think that's why, I think the percentage of market cap that's in public markets is declining, because it's not so much you can't do dynamic capability, but all the other board stuff coming down from the stock exchanges is forcing people to be distracted away from what's important. So it's really the distractions of a public market listing, and the composition of boards, and so forth, that makes it harder to do this in a public market context.
Right. Interesting sort of insights on the importance of how your story may need to shift depending on who you're telling it to, whether it's outside investors or private equity holders on the board. What about internally? There's a question here from Greg, internally to the organization. If executives panic, you create the sense of urgency and you're saying, right, we need to panic, maybe you have that conversation in the boardroom. What do you tell your employees?
No, you're much smoother. You don't want to necessarily upset your employees, but you have to convey a sense of urgency. So what's panic in the boardroom and in the executive suite translates through conveying a sense of urgency that time matters, and action matters, and we can't take for granted where we're at, and we've always got to be improving, and we've always got to be alert for the unknowns and be ready to adjust. So panic is not a good thing to have to bring in the whole workforce.
Very good. Question from Sam Blackburn. New Zealand's market and trading environment has largely rewarded commodity producers in narrow markets and investment towards less risky assets. Firstly, do you accept that proposition? Secondly, if you do you think this environment lends itself towards firms adopting dynamic capabilities? And if not, where are the tipping points to incentivize a shift?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, because if you're in a, quote, pure commodity market, then, you know, the only way to compete is to be more efficient. And that has become New Zealand's leitmotif. But even in commodity markets, it's really about innovation. I mean, you know, is fish a commodity or not? I mean, developing brands, developing stories, narratives. I mean, is a wine market a commodity market? In some sense it is, but there's also the opportunity to differentiate. And I think New Zealand's placed way too little emphasis on that. And that's where innovation can come in, not just in, you know, the way the product is produced, but also in the way the product is used and the way the product is presented. I'm just amazed that, you know, Cartier can sell a bag for, you know, $5,000 or something or other that probably costs no more than $250 to make. I mean, that tells you something about the intangible value of brands. You know, there's more opportunities than meet the eye, I think, with respect to commodity markets.
Excellent. Cool. A question from Svetlana. While dynamic capabilities are, you know, is generally important, I think we accept that proposition. And they may be the proposition is that they may be particularly critical at certain stages of business development. Well, is that true? And if so, what are the sorts of firm profiles that would benefit the most from strengthening their dynamic capabilities?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, you know, in economics, and at least economic history, in the sort of evolutionary economics, there's this notion of punctuated equilibrium, which I think is right. I mean, there are turning points, you know, the arrival of the internet, the arrival of AI. There are turning points when you really have to move fast. And there are periods in between that are relatively stable. So, you know, some people that say that, oh, you should be reconfiguring and changing everything every nanosecond, I don't think that's true. I think, you know, because those periods are calm when you can focus on efficiency. You just have to make sure you don't get blinded from the next pivot point. So the notion, I accept the notion of punctuated equilibrium, and there's a fair amount of empirical evidence to support it. But it also means you can't let down your vigilance. You may only have to exercise dynamic abilities every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, but if you don't keep the motor running, you'll miss the next pivot point or pivot opportunity, or you won't be the first one in.
Yeah. Related question. This is from David Spaziani. So he says he's someone who's worked at Kodak. He is someone who worked at Kodak in the advanced imaging division. He saw firsthand innovation being stifled by management within old perspectives, as you described. So I think this is a pretty practical question. So having decided to pivot, how does an organization successfully change its management practice so that it is able to drop last year's incentives and metrics and embrace the new? Now, just to expand on that, I've sort of seen this myself, is where the metrics and incentives used last year tend to be quite sticky, or they can be quite sticky. They have inertia, you know, especially if organizations have decided that's the right method for static efficiency purposes. How do you make that shift when you've decided, right, we need a different set of metrics? How do you proceed?
Well, you know, yeah, that's right. Yes, yesterday's KPIs can kill you, or lock you in. So, you know, there's this metaphor of the iron cage, and KPIs can be that iron cage. look, this comes back to the importance of boards. I mean, we don't study, and look, boards are studied over in law schools, and executive suite is studied in business schools. We and technology is studied over at engineering schools. These things all need to come together, and in particular, the board thing. I've come to recognize over time, having gone through, I've been CEO of 2 publicly traded companies. I've been through board debacles. Boards, particularly at these pivot points, is when boards have, well, they have authority always, but where they should be on the vanguard of the changes and recognizing it. Okay, it means you've got to change the KPIs. Yesterday's KPIs, they're gone. Someone has to be clear about articulating this to the enterprise. And it's sort of like it's like Churchill's speech, announcing the beginning of the Cold War, and where was it? Somewhere in the late 40s and 1950s. There are these key speeches where, management also, the story was it Nokia with the burning platform. We've got a burning platform here. This is where you have to be Churchillian as an executive, and you need the support of boards that at least would recognize the need to have a Churchillian. And by the way, it comes back to the selection of CEOs here is very important. None of the criteria I'm talking about are typically what, search firms have when they're looking for a CEO. Let me change that a little bit. Search firms, when they're hired to do searches, come up with, a whole bunch of yesterday's ordinary stuff. I mean, everything needs to change, and boards need to be on top of this. And that's why we're being distracted with, all of these questions about, well, we need new diversity on boards. We need diversity of thinking, most importantly, and how you get that, isn't necessarily correlated with gender and race, but you absolutely do need diversity, intellectual diversity and experience diversity, so that the things that a manager is only one person, the CEO is only one person. The board's job is to cover their blind spots, or at least help them on their blind spots. And so the composition of the board, I think, should be, in some sense, set in part to complement that of the CEO. And good companies do exactly that.
Right. Okay, so I think we've pretty much through all the questions. There's one more from Simon Wakeman, who I know you know. So we've traversed in the conversation a bit about competition policy, a bit about financial support to firms, etc. But Simon raises the question about education in the context of levers of government policy, things the government can do to encourage the sort of shift in mindset and culture and indeed human capability that you've been talking about. What's the role of education? And do you see any particular shifts of interest in the countries that you think are doing this well to prepare their workforce?
Well, first of all, New Zealand, like every other country, needs more STEM graduates and not more arts graduates. I don't mean to pick on the arts, but we need to double down, triple down with respect to engineering and science, and computer science and software. And New Zealand's really thin there. And so the composition of education and matters enormously. In terms of business education, look, I'm not aware of exactly what's going on. I think some of this stuff is that I'm talking about is recognized in New Zealand and taught. I think finance and economics sometimes stands in the way of some of this thinking. Jensen and Meckling, you got 150,000 sites for their paper on agency theory. I'm not sure agency theory deserves the attention that it has. I mean, we've been banging away at agency theory as a main way to think about how to control managers, and it's a distraction. You should be aware there's an agency problem, but you don't, over-fixate on these things. And as I said before, we tend to teach reductionist thinking. We to analyze things, it's easy to compartmentalize them, but then we don't do the job of pulling it back together. I like to joke that in business schools, we teach people do a great job of teaching accounting, finance, marketing, what have you, but we don't really pull it together. We really throw our students out on the street and tell them it's your job to pull it together, because the reality is the faculty doesn't know. There's no systems thinking on faculties, and that's what we need. You know, these problems lie between engineering, business, law, and many other departments, and so obviously the interdisciplinary is where this takes you, but it's interdisciplinary, you know, woven in with a good amount of practical experience in addressing real world problems, and it's very hard for most, you know, faculty to be able to master all of that. So what we have to do as teachers is we got to learn multiple disciplines, and also, you know, be able to weave together complex sets of ideas from different disciplines in order to come up with good solutions.
I think that's a great place to finish. Really good observation. Thank you so much for your insights. We are out of time. Thank you once again for your time, David, and your willingness to share your thoughts candidly and with us, and your long experience thinking about these things. Thanks also to everyone online for joining us today for what, as I promised, has been a really fascinating conversation. I think you've given us all, David, a lot of challenges, whether we're sitting in the public sector or in private organisations, or just as workers. You know, just thinking about how we should approach our jobs and go about dealing with the changes that are coming and already here in our environment. So thank you once again. Thank you also to everyone online. Let me just say that our next seminar in this series takes place on the 23rd of November. Our guest speaker for that event will be Dr. Dirk Pielaert, who may well be known to some of the audience. Dirk is currently with the Productivity Institute in the UK. He's going to explore the links between productivity, climate change, and innovation. So let me close our seminar today now, and farewell you all with a whakatauki, or a Māori proverb, which goes like this: Mā te korero ka mōhio, mā te mōhio ka marama, mā te marama ka mātou, mā te mātou ka ora te iwi. This whakatauki says that with discussion comes learning, with learning comes understanding. With knowledge, will be all people. So thank you once again, David, to everyone for participating today. Atawa.
Tim, thank you. And it was a delight to hear some familiar names, and I didn't see the familiar faces, but I'm really want to see what I can do to help with this mission if you take it on. Take care.
Keep in touch on that. Take care of yourself. Bye.